So, welcome everyone to another episode of Anita Das podcast, your invitation to explore topics related to holistic healing, therapies, spirituality, and much more. I'm so incredibly excited and honoured to welcome Andy Tomlinson and Reena Kumarasingham for today's episode. Andy and Reena are internationally renowned leading pioneers and experts in the field of regression, between lives spiritual regression, and exploration in the evolution of consciousness. So, in this episode, you'll have the opportunity to hear from them directly about the launch of their new book, which is called Between Lives Past Life Regression, Near Death Experiences, and Evolution of Consciousness. So, by way of introduction, Andy is a renowned expert in past lives and soul experiences between lives. He began his career in 1996, originally as a psychologist and psychotherapist, and then moved into therapy with past lives. Andy is the founder of the Past Life Regression Academy, which he set up in 2002 and has trained over 500 therapists worldwide. And he's also known for his books Healing the Eternal Soul, Exploring the Eternal Soul, and Transforming the Eternal Soul. Since 2014, Reena has led new consciousness retreats to expand people's consciousness and prepare them for the new earth. She originally started as a psychologist and moved into regression therapy and between lives spiritual regression, and then an international trainer in this area for the Past Life Regression Academy. Reena is also the author of past life books, Shrouded Truth, The Magdalene Lineage, and Divine Consciousness. Reena had an NDE in 2020, which has inspired this book, co-authored with Andy, which we will discuss today. So on a personal note, I've had the personal privilege and honour to have trained with both Andy and Reena in regression therapy, between lives spiritual regression, which we may refer to as BLSR for short, and pioneering the New Consciousness workshop. So it feels incredibly special for me to be able to discuss the publication of this new book. So welcome, Andy and Reena. I'm so incredibly excited to speak with you today.
Thank you so much for having us, Anita.
Yeah, welcome, Anita, and welcome to the audience. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you so much. So first of all, it would be great if you could just briefly share your background, how you started this journey with regression, between lives, and exploration of consciousness.
For me, it was having completed 4 years of training as a psychotherapist, and I asked the question, what happens if someone wants a past life? And I was told, just treat it like a metaphor. So that was the level of training I got. And then shortly after being qualified, a lady came to me and said, I keep getting the thought of Venice going on in my head. I just can't get it out. I'm just wondering if I had a past life there, could you do a past life regression? So I didn't really know what to do because I hadn't been trained, but I was trained in hypnosis. So I took her to a very deep level of trance, and she went spontaneously into a past life of being a madam responsible for prostitutes in Venice. And these were the lowest of the low at that time in society there. And I recorded it all. And when she came out, she hadn't remembered it. So I said, look, here's the recording. Go off and listen to it. And I bumped into her a couple of weeks later and she said, how could you? So I beg your pardon. She said, how could you? I got all my friends round to listen to this tape and I discovered what it was I was in as a madam in the past life. And it illustrates how the stories come through spontaneously with past. And that was really that started me on the path.
Incredible. Thank you so much for sharing. Reena, did you want to touch upon anything for your background?
Yeah, so I grew up a Hindu in Malaysia. So for me, past lives was just a fact of life. And I then did a degree in psychology. But when I graduated, when I was about 21 years old, I felt I wasn't ready to serve in this capacity. So I just went on and I did an MBA, and I ended up working in the corporate environment in the media industry in Asia Pacific. And then one day I felt I was bored. About 10 years in, I felt I was really bored with doing public relations in the media industry. And my public relations mentor said to me, Reena, if you're bored doing public relations in the media industry, you're better off getting out of public relations. And so I thought, that's a good idea. Let me just dip my toe into this psychological healing area. And I did a weekend course in NLP, and I thought, yeah, I'm still interested. And then someone called Andy Tomlinson started to advertise his program in Singapore, where he merged psychotherapeutic techniques with past lives. And so for me, that was like an incredible marriage, no pun intended. And so I attended the course, I paid for the course. Andy then decided to marry me and whisked me off from the tropical weather to English weather.
And didn't give a refund on the fee either.
Yeah. And yeah, so that's basically how I got started in the whole regression field.
That's beautiful. For me as well, it's been a lot of synchronicities just after, which we'll cross later, just coming across various people at various times just led me to this path. So thank you for sharing. And I think our viewers would be really interested to know how you came across this idea for this new book, how it was birthed.
So in 2020, I had a near-death experience because of COVID. It was the start of COVID. And my experience was quite profound for me. And one part of that experience, it was such a big experience for me. It was a turning point in my life. And one part of the experience was when I was pulled out of my body into this vast, expansive space. And I felt so expanded. I felt a peace that I've never felt before. I felt a freedom that I never felt before. And also, as I was pulled into this space, it was all anything that fed my ego, my egoic consciousness, fell away. All my anxieties, my fears. I had a few ambitions at that point. And I realized actually so much of it didn't matter in the real sense. In Hinduism, they talk about Maya, about how we live in a world of Maya, in illusion. And I felt that all these things that were feeding my ego were part of Maya, and it didn't really matter as much as I thought it initially had. And when I came back from my near-death experience, I felt that it took me about 2 months to get over COVID. And then it took me 3 months after that to really come to terms with the fact that I actually nearly died. You know it cerebrally, but then to actually integrate it and process it took some time for me. And in that time, I thought to myself, because I was teaching the Between Lives for the Past Life Regression Academy, so I was quite intimately aware of the process of the Between Lives, apart from the fact that I had it I've had a session myself. I thought, it's so interesting how the process, the near-death experience process, is very similar to the Between Lives process. And so I said to Andy, I shared this with Andy, and then we thought, is this unique to Reena's, my case? Or is it a universal thing that everyone experiences? Because if it is a universal thing that everyone experiences, then this is an amazing piece of evidence that consciousness survives the physical body in death, which is what a lot of people have been trying to do research on. The problem is people have been using a unidisciplinary approach, which is either near-death experience or mediumship or something. But we decided to look at near-death experience and Between Lives and put the two together. So that was one inspiration for the book. And then the second one was this huge expansive feeling. I shared that with Andy, and then we sat there and thought, is there a way for us to experience that expansion in the body? Like, we don't have to go through something as traumatic as a near death to actually experience it. And so that inspired the second part of the book, where we talk about how we can expand our consciousness in this body, especially in this new time of as the new consciousness is rising.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I guess it leads me to the next question. In the preface of the book, it touches upon your NDE and the impact it had. Are you able to just briefly touch upon the transformation and the direction of your life since that pivotal event?
Mm,
How things have changed and in what way?
yeah, I think there are a few main things that I brought back with me. The first thing is because I had experienced this huge expansion of consciousness. When I came back into my body, it was very interesting how that expansion of my consciousness still stayed with me. And I was picking up very subtle energies. I think a lot of people may call it becoming a little bit more psychic, but to me, it was picking up a lot more subtle energies. For example, I was looking out my balcony window as I was healing a few days or maybe a couple of weeks after my NDE. And I saw my neighbor was mowing his back lawn. And Andy came, and then I said, "Oh, our neighbor's having legal problems." And Andy asked me, "How do you know that?" I said, "I just do. The grass is green, the sky is blue, neighbor's having legal problems." And 2 weeks later, Andy bumped into him in the garden, and he shared that he was having legal problems with Andy. And so it's interesting because my sensitivity to subtle energies have become a lot more sharp. But I think for me, the main things are about this thing about how so many things don't matter. And I realized that our greatest currency, my greatest currency in our lifetime, our energy and our time, and how we spend our energy and time really enables us to live the sort of life we want to live, and how we normally fold ourselves into a pretzel to make everyone else happy or to fulfill everyone else's agenda. But when I was going through my near-death experience, number one, it was unexpected. Number two, nobody knew. Not even Andy knew. And I was thinking to myself as I was getting pulled, oh my gosh, this big thing is happening and I haven't told anyone. And then I thought, even after that, very few people's lives would actually be impacted if I passed away. You know what I mean? And then I thought, why am I folding myself up into a pretzel just to make other people happy? I have to honor and value how I use my time and my energy. And I'm actually quite particular and very strict about that. And so even if, these people who, if they come towards me and if any of them are in any way, shape or form disrespectful, I actually remove myself from their presence because that's not a good use of my time and energy. And I'm focusing on fulfilling like a dream that I have. And it doesn't matter what society or other people say about the dream. This is my dream, and I'm going to use my time and energy to pursue that dream. And hopefully it makes some money as I move forward. So I think I've become a lot more picky about how I use my time and energy. And I think that's the biggest takeaway that I've gone through.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it sounds like you've become more intentional about where you direct or focus your energy and how to create or manifest your desired kind of reality and being in alignment with your authentic self, who you are, and living your passion. Would that be a fair?
That's exactly right. And also knowing my worth. Knowing my worth enough that if someone there doesn't know my worth, I will just remove myself from that presence. And does that make sense?
Yeah, so having those kind of boundaries and understanding where it fits in with your energy. Thank you so much for sharing that. So part one of the book actually focuses on what consciousness is and whether it survives the physical death. And it's highlighted various areas of research, references telepathy, mediumship, lucid dreaming, out-of-body experiences, and much more. It's just providing kind of evidence that consciousness exists outside the body. So are you able to very, very briefly just maybe touch upon the value of looking at these areas in terms of supporting that consciousness debate? Maybe Andy, this might be.
Yes, of course, a lot of people either have the view of a very materialist position, which is that they can't see or touch or smell it, it doesn't exist. Or there's the view of consciousness being slightly different than that, that it doesn't necessarily reside in the body, but it resides outside the body, which is strange because a lot of people have experiences on a daily basis which would support consciousness being out of the body, such as being aware of someone looking at us from behind it, turning around and seeing them looking at us, or going into a room where there's been an argument. And even though the argument may have finished, you can feel it because they've left their consciousness behind in the room. But in the book, we try to introduce the subject of what consciousness is. At the root of all of this is an assumption. And the assumption that a lot of materialistic people take is that it all started with matter, like the Big Bang or whatever, and then eventually some sort of life form started, which was matter, and then it evolved into animals and eventually humans, and then humans at some point got a consciousness. So in other words, that is the thread. However, it is an assumption that at the beginning, everything started with matter. But what if everything started with consciousness? That consciousness created the matter, was there before the Big Bang, and has been part of consciousness the whole way through. And of course, if you come from that position, even though there's a lot of good information which should suggest consciousness is outside the body, and I'll talk about some of those examples briefly in a moment, there's very little to support the idea that everything started with purely matter. It's just an assumption people make. But some of the things that I found really remarkable about consciousness being outside the body, other than the near-death experiences and between life regressions, which we'll talk a little later about, is terminal lucidity. This is very common, and this is when people whose brain is totally incapable of thought or conversation, often people in a vegetable state with dementia, Alzheimer's, very advanced points where they're just effectively kept alive in this vegetable state, just before they die, become very coherent and are able to have rational conversations and say a few last things to people and then close their eyes and pass away and die. And this isn't an occasional thing. It has been reported it could be as high as 20% of all people who are in that state actually do this. But the medical professions can't understand it, so they push it to one side and hope it goes away because it doesn't fit into this materialistic paradigm. And one of the other fascinating areas is shared death experience. And that's when relatives who are at the deathbed of someone who's dying, as the person who's dying leaves the body, or as the conscious leaves the body, it's almost like they become aware of being on that journey with them and experiencing what it is that happens for them. And it's quite fascinating accounts. And some of them even come up with information which they couldn't possibly have if it wasn't a real experience. So there's a lot of experiences like this, telepathy and so on. And all of this is suggesting that consciousness isn't part of the body. It manifests itself through our bodies while we have it, but while our bodies no longer exist, it continues into an afterlife and then eventually reincarnates into the next life. And this is what comes out particularly from Between Lives Spiritual Regression. And there's lots of great books on that, goes into great details about that.
Yeah, so thank you. There are really excellent kind of cases described in the book where someone's passed and they're able to recall information that they couldn't possibly have known. It must be from some form of consciousness beyond the death. So that's all explained in the book. There's lots of research and evidence there.
And we have lots of interesting case studies because I think case studies are much more profound. And we're not putting forward our views about what things ought to be or not in terms of this conscious debate. We're sharing people's experiences, and that's very real for the people. Certainly with near-death experiences, the work by a number of leading medical doctors, Pim Van Lovell, who is a Dutch cardiac specialist who worked with many near-death experience clients and had a questionnaire where he found out about their near-death experience and all the events that it was covered. And similar work by Bruce Grayson, an American who's been working for two decades doing this sort of work. And in the UK, Peter Fenwick has written a book. He analysed through questionnaires 300 near-death experiences. And all of these have got a very consistent approach, and all of the medical alternative theories have been dismissed because there's no other explanation or rational explanation other than consciousness has been surviving this death experience. And just to mention that in some cases, the physical body has been, the heart stopped or the brain stopped, and yet still these conscious memories existed.
Yeah, absolutely. For those watching, if you want to get into more detail, in Andy's book includes lots of references of research other early pioneers have done and lots of case studies. So the details all there in the book. So just moving on, do you feel that there's some connection that some of the kind of early pioneers had with what's known as the Akashic records that many people have become familiar with, as well as some of the more modern systems that we hear about now, such as human design? Could this add further evidence to the consciousness debate?
Within the form of Hinduism that I was brought up in, I don't know if you've heard about this or some of your viewers would have heard about this, but we have these Hindu priests who come and they read leaves, a certain leaf. I can't remember the name of it offhand. It's a Tamil word and I'm not very good at Tamil. Don't tell my parents this. And in these leaves, they write down, I think you just give them your name and your birth date. And they pull a leaf out that already has all the details of your mom, your dad, your work, and like a lot of things that happen in your life. And it's very interesting because I've never had a reading, but I really want to do it because I find it so interesting. But I know a lot of my friends in Malaysia have had it. And it just, for me, it's very similar to having the Akashic records come down in a very material form of these leaves, because the information, I'm not quite sure how they get the information, but it's already there in the leaves. And it's also very similar to the sort of information we get from the Between Lives, where we find out how you plan lives. And so I actually feel that in terms of consciousness, it's been there. It's always been there. Like even with past life regression used for healing, within Hinduism, past life regression was just a way of life. Sorry, past lives are just a way of life. But past life regression used for healing was actually introduced by a gentleman called Patanjali in the 2nd century. Yeah, 2nd century. And this was done in India. And then it's almost like the Western framework is catching up with ancient traditions. Does that make sense? And I only know about Hinduism. I'm not quite sure. Maybe there are other forms of esoteric knowledge that extends beyond Hinduism that talk about consciousness in these ways. But I think now we're just trying to merge more science and spirituality together so that it's made more palatable for the Western world.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And I'm familiar with what you mentioned. I was also raised within the Hindu religion, so I'm familiar with. It's actually amazing how this information is just accessed, but obviously it's come down the generations as part of their practice. This is what their vocation is, but it's and like you said, I think it's broader. It's across other traditions. So thank you for sharing that. So sorry, did you want to say something?
No, I said that's all right. My pleasure.
Just following on with our discussions on consciousness, how would you distinguish between the consciousness and the soul and the role that they play?
So I think everything has a consciousness. You know, our physical body has a consciousness. Each cell has a consciousness. As Andy was talking about just now with what if there's consciousness comes first and then the material aspect comes as birth from consciousness. I was watching a video on Facebook where someone had some super high-tech gear, and I'm not the most techie person, so I can't explain the technology behind this, but they took a video of a sperm and then going into an egg, like an ovum. Yeah, like the merging of the sperm and the ovum. And just before the merging of the sperm and the ovum, or just as they merged, there was a flash of light. And so the thing there is energy came at conception, right? And to me, that energy is consciousness. And so the way I would describe it is, if I would use the analogy of water, in ice, before that, let's talk about string theory first, because everyone has broken matter down into the smallest particle ever. And what they have found is that the smallest particle right now that we know of is vibrating energy that looks like string. It's just vibrating so fast that it looks like string. And we are all made of this vibrating energy. So if we take water as an example, when it's in an ice form, everything is really dense and packed together. And to me, that is our physical body. It's all vibrating string packed together. Our thoughts and emotions, that's like flowing water. You know, there's a bit of flow and a bit of denseness, but there's just flowing. And for me, our soul is like gas, where it's super subtle, but super powerful at the same time. So that's how I would differentiate between consciousness, which is in everything, and the soul, which is the most subtle form of our consciousness that we can access, and the one that continues on as we, even when the physical body and the mental body sort of declines, just like, you know, in the world, because the ice turns to water, that turns to gas. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Just providing those examples just helps to forge that understanding of these different levels that we have.
Yeah.
You know, we have these layers, and it's just making that more easy to understand. And so I guess the question might arise as to how breath is connected with consciousness and the expansion of consciousness. Some may say it's like a physical manifestation of consciousness. When you had your NDE experience, what was your experience with your breath? Are you able just to share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because when I had my NDE experience, it was due to lack of breath. So I died because I wasn't breathing. And because of that, I had my whole consciousness expanded, which then led me to quite a lot of my new way of thinking and new way of being, as it were. But I think whilst you're in the body, what breath helps us do is to disengage from the loud noises from the outside, and it connects to the quieter parts. Because if you want to connect to things like your soul or your even emotional, because it's so subtle, you can't have so much noise around you, it distracts you. And so people focus on the breath to just connect deeper to the more subtle parts of ourselves and our consciousness, the subtler consciousness. But if we're disciplined enough to just connect immediately to the subtler forms of consciousness and disengage from the loud noise from the outside, I don't think we necessarily need the breath, because in my NDE experience, my breath stopped and then I just went, shh.
So the breath can as a bridge into becoming that deeper self, inner self-awareness.
Exactly.
Meditation, there's lots of focus on pranayama and breathing exercises as a way to still the mind and focus within. So yeah.
Exactly. It is to disengage from the noise.
Yeah, thank you so much. And so I just want to touch on a few kind of more modern themes, just to consider what your views are on artificial intelligence and how this could impact our consciousness, or any kind of sharings or thoughts on that, around that.
I would say one way of looking at artificial intelligence is any of the technology that come through. It could be knives, for example. Knives could be used by someone as a surgeon, where they do amazing work to bring about healing, or they can be used in some sort of violent act. So the tool itself isn't the important thing, is how it's used. And the same really applies to artificial intelligence. There's aspects of our life that can be made a lot easier, perhaps help in doing jobs or not doing things that we wouldn't want to do. Maybe one time they'll do all the cleaning of the house for us, which would be absolutely wonderful. I'd be looking forward to that. Or perhaps even driving the car, so you can engage in it, which I think in America, they're pretty much advanced in that path anyway. But there's also the other side of artificial intelligence you have to be very careful of. There are some people that would like to use artificial intelligence for their own purposes of enslaving the world. So I think it's up to us, citizens of the world, is to monitor it and to challenge anything that is the use of a tool in an inappropriate way, just as we do with knives. If people use knives for violence, we have ways of tackling it, of stopping it happening. And we need to do the same with artificial intelligence.
Right, yeah, because we're saying that it doesn't possess that kind of the true consciousness that we've been talking about, that self-awareness. So it's how we're using this intelligence as a tool to serve us in a positive way.
Yeah. Can I add something to that?
Sure.
And this is just my opinion. It's not something I've read or anything, but if we go back to whether it's a story or it really happened, if we go back to Atlantis, where man used technology and cut away from their consciousness from source, you know what I'm saying, and started to abuse what was happening around them using technology. And then obviously that didn't fit in well with the consciousness of the earth at that time. And then there was a flood to wipe them all off. I think that is almost like a warning for us living right now about how much dependence we could get into with technology, which will then cut us away from a natural way of being that may or may not necessarily be, and this is something I don't know yet, it may or may not necessarily be in line with the new consciousness, the way the earth's vibrations are shifting towards. So I think that's just a cautionary tale.
Okay, no, that's interesting, because obviously there's so much kind of information about those ancient civilizations of Lemuria and Atlantis and how that fall kind of came about, the technology that was used. So yeah, it's just about being mindful and aware of how we're using it and how it's benefiting others. So that's really helpful. Thank you for sharing that. I just wanted to touch upon the chapters on NDE, near-death experience in past lives, as adding further evidence of examples in the book where NDEs where people were blind or they had no brain activity, and it touches upon the impact of those NDEs. What are your thoughts on whether the NDE serves a specific role and whether this NDE is pre-planned by the soul prior to incarnation as perhaps a trigger or a catalyst for their soul evolution and growth?
Certainly from the between life experiences that I've done over 20 years, the theme that seems to come through is that the major events in our life are planned. It's the smaller events that aren't planned. So that, for example, the parents that we have, the people who are family members, the people who may be supporting us, or maybe the people who are giving us a particularly difficult time, they have probably been brought in for a particular lesson that we learn. And in between these lessons is time for us to just settle and recover till the next lesson comes. And often a lot of these are emotionally based, of working through different sorts of emotions. I've never had anybody in one of my Between Life Regression talk about having a near-death experience specifically as part of their soul plan. But I have had a number who have needed to have some sort of spiritual experience in order to bring about the shift that they want. It could quite well be because some of these are based on accidents. Accidents happen, and you can't always pre-plan accidents. If someone's driving a car and something unexpected happens and they have a near-death experience as a result, then obviously that's down to an accident. But I suspect certainly some of the illnesses and things of that nature, which possibly I've got maybe some sort of soul plan behind them, they could quite well be. So I think it's a mixture of both, would be my take on it.
And I guess it's going to be quite unique to each individual in what their soul self looking in terms of the growth and how this is best experienced in incarnation. So it's going to be quite individual, I would have thought.
Yeah.
And then for those viewers that are watching, and maybe they're not so familiar with all this terminology, regression, between life spiritual regression, do you think you could just very briefly just touch upon the differences between a regression, a near-death experience, and between life spiritual regression, just at a very high level?
Oh, okay. Past life regression refers to people in a light level of trance being guided into the events of a past life. Sometimes it can be simply by saying, giving the command to go to a past life connected to it, or sometimes people spontaneously go into past lives through focusing on emotions or physical sensations. So, but whatever it is, if it's been done for therapeutic reasons, then the therapist would use the past life in order to help bring about some sort of positive change in the person's current life. The other thing you mentioned, or we've been talking about, is between life spiritual regression. Sometimes this is called life between life regression, and this is about using very deep hypnosis so that the mind is quite inactive, or at least the conscious mind is inactive, and then guiding someone through a past life death and then into the memories that emerge. And we refer to these as soul memories between lives. And typically it goes through a sequence of being out of the body, looking down, very similar to near-death experiences, of meeting light or various people, could be spirit guides or people from the past life, and there's some sort of reunion with them. And again, there's a lot of similarities with that near-death experience with that. And then at some point, past life reviews. Obviously, with a current life, that's not past life review because they're going to be going back. Otherwise, it's not a near-death experience. But certainly, review of their current life takes place. And this is quite important from a between-life regression because it helps the soul understand what went well, what didn't go so well in that life, and it forms the basis of what's planning to be done for the next life. So, for example, if someone was in a position of being powerlessness and they gave up on life because of it, they may want to work on that and have a similar situation where there's powerlessness for them to find a way of working through it, because it's like the soul learns by achieving things. It's literally like when we're at school, if we fail an exam, you need to go back and resit it so we can then progress up to different levels of education.
Okay.
And then eventually, at some point after the planning for the next life, the soul talks about incarnating into the human body. So there's a full cycle all the way from the death in the past life all the way through to the birth. And it's normally the birth in the current life if the therapist is guiding it that way. And then the last one is near-death experiences. And these are experiences people have either through accidents or with medical diseases or illnesses where they are thought to be dead, like the heart stops beating, the breath stops. In many cases, the brain activity completely ceases. And yet the person has memories of being out of the body and some of the experiences I was talking about before. And as you mentioned before, even some people who have been blind in their physical life, all of a sudden are able to see the body below or see other aspects of the life because they're seeing it through their consciousness as opposed to the limitations of the human body. And then at some point, the souls either choose to come back or they're asked to come back because there's some aspect of life that they need to continue with.
There's a really useful kind of an insightful comparison between the NDEs and Between Lives Spiritual Regression in the book, and including for those who've experienced both, such as myself, where I've experienced two Between Lives Spiritual Regression as well as a near-death experience. So I can really see the differences between the two and the benefits of both. And this is the first time that I've opened up about it really in the book. There is a description of the impact that I felt about that near-death experience, and it's different for everyone. But what do you feel are the main benefits for people to experience between life spiritual regression in cases where they have or they haven't had a near-death experience? Why would someone want to go through the between lives? What would be the benefit for them?
The near-death experience is something that's not planned, it happens.
But just as a caveat, we don't recommend everyone go out and have a near-death experience. It's something spontaneous.
If someone says they're doing a workshop where he's having a near-death experience, please don't go on it. Or at least don't say we recommended you go on it. But when it does happen, people do have a profound experience, but it's the impact to them. And Reena's talked about some of the profound experiences she's had. And in the research that's been done by some of the medical pioneers, this is very, very common with a lot of the people who have had this experience. With Between Lives Spiritual Regression, this is when people consciously choose to experience more about discovering who they really are. That's far deeper than just what job do I have, what name do I have. They really want to discover more information about their soul and their purpose for this life. But people do come out of that transformed, and although it's not quite as transformational as the near-death experience, it is very transformational. And I think one of the things that makes the near-death experience so transformational is that many people who are perhaps skeptic of this whole area suddenly go through a big transition of being a skeptic to a non-skeptic. Whereas a lot of people who are coming for the Between Lives Spiritual Regression have got a certain amount of awareness in that area, so they're looking for a deeper aspect for it. But with both of them, it's an opportunity to experience the wonderful world of expanded consciousness. Reena was talking about it earlier. And this is the theme that we've tried to make in half of the book by saying you can start to expand your consciousness without having to have a near-death experience and without having to have a Between Lives Spiritual Regression. Of course, if you have one, you can have that. So we have lots of exercises in there and tips to help people on this path. And we think it's so important because the more people that can expand the consciousness and start to approach life from a basis of pure love, unconditional love, rather than the approach that a lot of people take in the present world, which is about greed and fear, it will just simply transform the world from the difficulties we all see around us into something entirely new that some people have called the golden age or the new world.
Yeah. May I add something to that? With Between Lives, it's really interesting because you get a lot of spiritual insights to a lot of challenges that we face in our lives. We learn things like life lessons, our life mission, things like that. And that when you get a higher vision or a higher insight into our daily mundane grind, it gives us a new breath of life. It breathes in a new breath of life, as it were, into our lives. And then we can move forward with knowing what our life lessons are and what our life mission is. And I think that is the biggest gift that Between Lives Spiritual Regression can do. And it also connects us very intimately to our soul. The thing with near-death experience is that it happens in real time, and so it's very visceral. Whereas with Between Lives, it's still a memory. You're still accessing it via a memory. You still know that you're in the couch and your therapist is guiding you, so you can hear that. But the transformation is deeper with the near death because it's very visceral and it's real time. But that doesn't take away from the depth and the understanding and the transformation that the Between Lives can give you with these amazing spiritual insights.
Thank you so much for sharing. And there is a lot of information in the book from case studies. And from a personal perspective, having experienced both, I mean, with Between Lives, you've got that sense of anticipation of, that you're going to be experiencing this. You even have questions ready. There's an opportunity to speak to what are known as wise ones or the council elders and have some kind of clarity on your soul mission, direction, purpose. And for me, it was a sense of floating up and of recalling, remembering soul memory. So it was a really lovely experience of being held as well by your therapist. You're in a safe space. And like you said, the near-death experience was completely unexpected, but also it's very real. It's not a sense of floating. You are literally pulled out from your body. So it's very real. But again, for both, there's so much opportunity for kind of transformation and learnings and really expanding the consciousness. Yeah. And again, there's so much more in the book that expands on that, on the impact of both. So thank you for sharing. So thank you so much for accessing part 1 of this episode, which relates to part 1 of the book on what consciousness is and does it survive physical death. So you can access part 2 in a separate episode, which touches upon part 2 of the book on how to create a new consciousness for a new earth. It demystifies the terminology and explains a bit more about what this shift means for each of us. So I do hope that you enjoy part 2 as much as you've enjoyed part 1. Thank you.